Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Vickery, and I'm a program director at the School of Medicine. I'll be moderating today's session of Mini Medical School, led by the Dean of the School of Medicine, Dr. Selwyn Vickers, and a panel of other key School of Medicine leaders. We'll begin with opening remarks from Dr. Vickers, then we'll hear from our panelists. We will have 20 minutes of Q&A time after we've heard from all of the panelists. I've collected all of the questions that were pre-submitted, and we will get to as many as possible. To submit a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again for joining us. And now I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Selwyn Vickers, Dean of the School of Medicine. Dr. Vickers.
Thank you, Katie. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Selwyn Vickers, as Katie mentioned, the Dean of the School of Medicine and Senior Vice President of Medicine. I'm excited about this evening because it's a chance for us to share some of the details around the vaccine related to COVID-19, as well as some of the advances and challenges we faced. This whole process of the mini medical school is to introduce you in a reasonable way to some of the science advancements and treatments, as well as some of our most outstanding faculty. So I'm excited that you all are on the call and the Zoom session. I am also excited about what you're going to hear. Before I begin introducing our speakers, I want to thank Dr. Herb Chin, Dr. Sherry Cannon, Dr. Nafsinger, and Dr. Moratzo and Mike Sag for the work that they put together as committee leaders for planning out this mini medical school session. Thank you for your time and effort and for the energy putting this lineup and these speakers together. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers and get them started to sharing with you what they're going to talk about and give you some insights to this whole process of vaccination, vaccines, COVID-19, as well as the challenges and struggles we faced. Paul Gifford is professor of medicine and microbiology, and he's director of our vaccine research clinic. Paul will talk about vaccines and how they work. He's a national and international expert, recognized for his leadership and development, and was the leader of our Johnson & Johnson vaccine trial study here at UAB. Jeannie Moratzo is our director of our division of infectious disease. Jeannie is a passionate and unbelievably caring, but also engaging physician leader. As many of you know, Jeannie has been visualized around the world in the country, being the voice of reason and information for our country for COVID-19, as well as being an outstanding leader in our School of Medicine. And finally, Mike Sag. Mike is an internationally known leader for fighting viral diseases, particularly HIV. He's known across the globe for his work in HIV, literally because he's done work across the globe, but he's also known here in our state about his care and concern about COVID-19 and its impact on the citizens of Alabama. And he too has been a voice from UAB and Alabama to the country and the world. Mike and Jeannie will talk about some of the challenges our states have faced, the rising case numbers, and the things that we have to continue to be aware of as we work our way through this pandemic. So let's get started. Paul, we'll let you go first and begin to help us understand about how the vaccines work.
All right, thank you. So I'm very excited to tell you about this. I know I've been working in the vaccine field for over 25 years now, and this is clearly the most exciting thing that's ever happened in the vaccine field over that time, and arguably, possibly, it's among the top vaccine things that has happened. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an overview of the immune responses, just to break it down simplistically. There's immunity, and that's broken up into innate immunity, which is really things like your skin, like certain cells that are there all the time. We won't talk about that because that actually is difficult to change with the vaccine. Rather, what we look at is adaptive immunity that's shown here on the top. And then in adaptive immunity, there's natural adaptive immunity and artificial adaptive immunity. For natural adaptive immunity, there's passive transfer of antibodies. And the best example of that is a mother to infant transfer of antibodies, either in the placenta or with breast milk. And that actually can be very important to infant health in that situation. And then there's active natural immunity. And one example of that is infection with COVID. As you know, people who get COVID infection, fortunately, most of the people do recover. The people who recover actually have natural protection, at least for 3 months, possibly as long as 6 months. And so they do have protection that's probably antibody mediated. And then there's artificial adaptive immunity. And then again, that's broken up into passive and active. In passive, I don't know why I have maternal there, that's wrong, but in passive, it's things like monoclonal antibodies. Antibodies that are actually have been developed for COVID. We won't talk about that too much, but there are antibodies by Eli Lilly and Regeneron that have been given to many individuals who've been ill, including the President of the United States. And that has helped decrease hospitalization rates. And then finally, what we're here to talk about today is active immunization, where you give somebody a vaccine and hope to get an immune response that's protective. So next. So I'm going to talk a bit about the mRNA vaccine, because this is this novel technology that has never been used before in terms of developing a clinical vaccine. And this is really remarkable technology. And what's shown here then is the genome and the coronavirus. So SARS-CoV-2 is shown here. And these spike proteins we know from many years ago from SARS-1 in 2003 that are very important. It's kind of the Achilles heel of the coronavirus. So if you can develop an immune response against it, we knew early on that that would be probably problematic for the virus. mRNA takes the gene that encodes that virus, that spike protein, and they take this, and then they take that mRNA, and mRNA is very volatile. It degrades extremely quickly. And so, I'm sorry, Katie, you advance, right? And so the breakthrough in mRNA technology, which has been around for about 15 years, is that they've been able to stabilize it somewhat by encasing it in a lipid nanoparticle. And this allows it then to be somewhat stable, although as many of you know, the Pfizer vaccine still has to be stored at minus 70 degrees and the Mrna vaccine at minus 20 degrees. But nonetheless, it allows it to be stable for a period of time. And then next, when you then inject the individual into the deltoid, into the arm, you inject it into their muscle cells. This nanoparticle is taken up by those muscle cells. And then the beauty of this technology is it uses your own cells in your body to actually become protein factories. And so it makes the protein, the spike protein, and it makes it exactly how the virus would make it. And so this is very important for the immune system. Some of these proteins are then secreted from the cell, and they're picked up by antigen presenting cells, which is the next one. And these antigen presenting cells then go to the lymph node, and they actually then engage T cells and B cells. And these B cells then make these antibodies. And these antibodies can perfectly then recognize the spike protein. And then when then a person is potentially confronted with the actual virus, it then recognizes this spike protein on the virus, and then these antibodies that are known as neutralizing antibodies can then destroy that virus. And finally, these vaccines, it's not as well publicized, but they also induce these T cells, and these T cells can actually kill virally infected cells as well. So if they don't completely prevent the infection, these T cells then can potentially get rid of the infection much more quickly. So one of the amazing things is how rapidly these the Mrna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine have been developed. And remember that one of the things that happened, remember December 31 of 2019, I guess a year and a half ago, or I guess it's been a year ago, COVID was first reported. 10 days after that, they actually sequenced the virus, or they probably sequenced it before that, but then the Chinese actually let that information go public. And 7 days after that, the NIH with Mrna actually developed the mRNA vaccine. Now that is extremely fast, 7 days to develop a vaccine. Using old technology, it would have taken months, if not years, to do that. And so then March 16th, they already started their phase 1/2 study with that. April 16th, as part of Operation Warp Speed, the Mrna got a substantial amount of money to do clinical trials and product development. And then they started their phase 3 trial July 27th. They got more money August 11th in order to support Mrna from produce the COVID vaccine. And then, as most of us know, then November 16th, which is 1 week after Pfizer had very similar results, the company showed that this vaccine was 94% effective. And then a month after that, they have FDA approval in the form of emergency use authorization. So many people then are concerned, how did this happen so quickly? And is the vaccine safe if it's been sort of rushed, if you will, and this happened so quickly? And I think the vaccine has still gone through the normal process, but at a very rapid pace. And we've been very lucky with certain factors that have happened that have allowed this vaccine to develop very quickly. The first is that we knew back with SARS-1, back in 2003, that the spike protein was a very important part of the virus that you needed to target with the vaccine. Because if you're able to target it, it actually, it hurts the virus tremendously. So we knew that already, and we figured that SARS-CoV-2 would be just like that. So COVID would be very much the same way. So we banked on the fact that spike protein was the protein to target, and then ultimately that ended up being the case. And then I talked about this rapid identification of the problem of SARS-CoV-2, and the rapid sequencing and making that public was extremely helpful. mRNA technology is very rapid to develop. It's expensive, but you can develop a vaccine very rapidly, and you can produce it very rapidly as well. So it's expensive, it's difficult to distribute because of the storage requirements, but it's a very rapid way to do it, and that helped as well. There's also, they combine some of the vaccine phases. There's 3 phases of a vaccine, 1, 2, and 3, with 1 and 2 being safety and immunogenicity, and they combine them, which helped avoid some of the regulatory delays. The other thing that's extremely important is that many, many community members were extremely engaged in these studies, and they rapidly enrolled volunteers into these studies. So to give you an idea, Mrna enrolled over 30,000 individuals, Pfizer enrolled over 45,000 individuals, and Johnson & Johnson, that Dr. Vickers was talking about, that I'm involved in, enrolled 44,000 individuals. So that kind of rapid enrollment is really what helped. And finally, and somewhat sadly, the only way you can determine if a vaccine works is to have ongoing infections. And most of these vaccine studies started enrolling when the epidemic curve started increasing. And so these large number of infections have actually helped us determine that these vaccines work. So the question is it effective? And this is, again, from the Mrna, and Pfizer has almost a superimposable graph. And what you can see is this is the cumulative event rate. So this is the number of people, or the percentage of people in the trial who got infected. And remember, there's 15,000 or thereabouts in each one. 15,000 received placebo, 15,000 received the vaccine. And then you follow them over time. And here it's 120 days after the vaccination. And what you can see is that the placebo group gets a significant number of infection. In this case, 3 to 3.5% of placebo recipients became infected in 120 days. So they clearly vaccinated the right group. As opposed to the mRNA vaccine, where a fraction of that became infected with COVID. And this is 95% effective. What was interesting and surprising and gratifying was that even after a single dose, you can see that you start seeing a separation of these lines, and that translated to 92% efficacy after just a single dose. Now, I caution you though, if you were just to take one dose and say, I'm protected, I'm good, the problem is we don't know how long that protection lasts, and it likely does not last that long. So you still are going to need 2 doses to get long lasting protection. But it is very gratifying to see that even after 14 days after the first dose, you start seeing protection. So there's been a lot about vaccine side effects, and this is a really nice slide that just put this in context. So in the middle two, you have the Mrna and you have the Pfizer vaccine. And what you can see is that you have the different side effects that are shown here. You have local pain, redness, and swelling. And what this shows you is basically it tries to tell you how well tolerated a vaccine is compared to these different vaccines. So this is the flu vaccine, the 2 COVID vaccines, and the shingles vaccine that is the new shingles vaccine that's recommended in individuals 50 years of age and older. And what you can see is that the majority of people do have local pain at the site of injection, and that's true with the Shingrix or the COVID vaccines. And then they also have, the majority of people after 2 doses have systemic symptoms as well. However, when you look at the grade of these symptoms, the worst vaccine in terms of making you feel the worst is the Shingrix vaccine, followed by these COVID vaccines, and then followed by the flu vaccine. I will say though that most people do have symptoms. Most people will get a sore arm, and most people after 2 doses will get some sort of systemic symptom, including fatigue or headache. However, I think most people should also realize that these symptoms all go away within a day, 2 days at the most. And it's really your immune system working. Your immune system is recognizing this foreign protein as a potential invader, and therefore you're likely getting a very good immune response with this. And by the way, it's also interesting that the Shingrix vaccine that causes, these side effects is also highly effective. As we know now are the COVID vaccines. The least effective one is actually the flu vaccine with at best 60% efficacy. And it is interesting that it causes the least amount of symptoms as well. So some of the vaccine myths, I talked about this already. It was rushed and it will not be safe. It's gone through all the safety procedures. It is true that that if it's a rare event that occurs in, let's say, 1 in 100,000 individuals, then it's not going to be seen in these early efficacy studies. However, they are monitoring all these side effects in post-marketing, if you will. And one of the things that we have seen is possibly a higher rate of anaphylaxis. It's still about 1 to 2 in 100,000 that's occurring, but we are seeing that with these vaccines. And then the side effects from the vaccine are not severe. In most cases, they're mild to moderate. And it's certainly better than having the virus in almost all cases. Now, there are people who develop COVID and they don't have symptoms, but it's likely that still the vaccine, there are some people who also get vaccinated who don't develop symptoms either. So getting the vaccine by and large is much less problematic than having the actual infection. This is another myth that's been propagated. There are people who have died in COVID vaccine trials, but there hasn't been any that have died that have been attributed to the vaccine. Remember that in many of the trials, we vaccinate elderly individuals because those are at highest risk. And so you can imagine that if you vaccinate somebody who's 80 or 90, they can die of something else. I should also say that one of the most notable deaths was in Brazil, an individual who died of COVID. But you're enrolling people who are at risk for COVID, and that individual actually received placebo and not the vaccine. And so, yes, people die in these trials. You can imagine that when you enroll 30,000 people, that especially in an elderly population, that some people are going to die, but it has not been attributed to the vaccine. So if I've had COVID, I won't have to get the vaccine because I'm already immune. So that is partly true. If you actually had the infection, you won't need to immediately get the vaccine. It's recommended that you wait 3 months because there's studies shown by the CDC and the British in the United Kingdom that you are actually highly protected against recurrent COVID infection within 3 to 6 months. However, the antibody responses in many people who are infected with COVID decrease very quickly. And we worry that you are likely going to be at risk of getting infected thereafter. And so a vaccine is recommended after 3 months. So I don't know how to answer this. This is not true. It's interesting tracking us. I mean, if people wanted to track us, they can already just follow you through your phone, I guess. I'm not sure why they would need to do this, but there's no evidence for that. And there's really no way to refute that other than saying that it just doesn't happen. And I don't know why that would happen anyway, or why anybody would want to do that. Next. So I might be allergic to the vaccine, but I won't know until I get it. So like I said, that people can be allergic to it and you don't know exactly, but the vast majority of people have no allergies to this vaccine. In fact, even people who had severe allergic reactions to another vaccine, let's say flu vaccine, they can still get this vaccine. And remember, most places that give the vaccine, especially UAB, for instance, have medical personnel that are on site with epinephrine pens that are there too, in case something like this were to happen. And Dr. Nassinger can talk about this, but it's a very rigorous process and a very organized process where you actually have to wait 15 minutes if you've never had a reaction before, and 30 minutes if you've had an anaphylactic reaction before. It's still very safe to get the vaccine. So this is interesting. A lot of people do say that the vaccine may make you more vulnerable to illness. And this is true with dengue. There are some vaccines that can make you worse with illness to dengue. And then also in SARS-1, there was some animal models in ferrets that showed that it may make them worse if you give them the vaccine. So we were actually very worried about this when we first started vaccinating individuals as a possibility with SARS-CoV-2 or COVID. But fortunately, we do not see this. We do not see this in multiple studies. It's not to say it's never going to happen. It may happen in the future with waning immunity, but it seems highly unlikely now. And we have not seen this at all. So it doesn't make you more vulnerable to illness. In fact, it's 95% protective of illness. And there've actually been a lot of tests involving people with underlying conditions. If you look at the Mrna study and the Pfizer study, for instance, if you look at their publications, they actually have tables of people with underlying conditions, and they show, amazingly enough, that it works just as well in people with underlying conditions as people without any underlying conditions, which is fantastic. So I can talk about this a little bit, but this is unfortunately something that continues to be in the lay press, that vaccines cause autism. The way this all got started was a study that was published in Lancet on a handful of people and a doctor that was conflicted and has since lost his license. And he actually was conflicted because he wanted to have he had his own measles vaccine that he thought would be better. And so he assigned the MMR vaccine as causing autism. And that was based, I think, on 15 to 20 individuals that he kind of handpicked. That study was rejected and retracted by the Lancet. And since then, they've done studies on tens of thousands of kids without any link to autism and vaccines. So it continues to be out there, but if you look at the scientific evidence, there's actually no evidence that vaccines cause autism. So the question of whether or not you need to be vaccinated every year, one factor that goes into that has to do with vaccine durability. And they're looking at that. Unfortunately, since these vaccines are so new, we don't have a huge amount of data on that. This again is the Mrna vaccine, where you can see in different age groups here that immune responses do decline, as you might expect, but they don't decline to nothing, and they're still detectable at 4 months following the last immunization. This is an ongoing thing that we're going to look at, but clearly this is good news that it doesn't decline that rapidly. And it may well be that boosting immunizations will be needed in the future, such as the flu shot, but only time will tell on that. I think Dr. Sag is going to take over now. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to talk about the bigger picture here. And it really is a tale of two epidemics of sorts. We are clearly going through the worst of times that I'll share with you, unfortunately, after the holidays from Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. This month is clearly the worst that we're going to see, I hope. And maybe by mid to late February, we'll be better. But if you think back to March and April when we went into lockdown and we talked about flattening the curve, well, guess what? We were real successful at that. We actually made it happen. And then I think we got tired of doing those things. And quite honestly, I don't think there was a great connection between what we were asking people in the public to sacrifice, especially in terms of businesses, but then having the CARES Act there to rescue people as their businesses might suffer. So that disconnect made it even more difficult for us to maintain that, even though from a public health perspective, it would have kept things under control. And especially in the last phase here that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, we are in the worst state we've ever been right now. And that translates in terms of not only number of cases and number of deaths, but also our hospitals are pretty full and emergency rooms are really stretched. Next slide. One thing I'd like to keep in perspective here, we are now about at 400,000 deaths just in the United States. And when you think about that compared to all the wars in the latter half of the last century, there were 101,000 deaths. And as you can see on the right, by the time tomorrow is over, we will have eclipsed the total number of casualties, deaths in World War II that the United States suffered. And daily, we're having somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 deaths a day. And going back to that, many of us saw Saving Private Ryan. And as the Higgins boats were coming into Omaha Beach, we saw the horror of the bullets flying and people dropping. And the total number of deaths on Omaha Beach was roughly about 1,000. We're seeing that number of deaths every day in the first 6 to 7 hours of the day. And then it multiplies 3 more times as the day goes on. And that's day after day after day after day. And I think that we've become numb by the numbers, but this is the worst catastrophe, I think, in terms of loss of human life in the United States, in the history of the United States. So this is clearly the worst of times that we're experiencing right now. So as we think about vaccination, let's play a little thought experiment here and ask the question, if what Dr. Gifford just went over with us had failed, yeah, we could have developed the vaccine, but then we go to those phase 3 studies and they don't protect. What's our exit ramp then? How do we get out of that? And from my perspective, we don't. I don't see any reason why this infection would not just keep churning in the population, not only in the US, but globally. And that's an imponderable at some point. But instead, we do have a vaccine. And the vaccine is, next slide, our Deus Ex Machina. For those of you who might have studied Greek tragedies in high school or college, you might remember that in the Greek tragedy in the plays, the protagonist, if they get cornered by enemies, that Zeus or some god would come and rescue them out of the situation. And it was represented in the play as a machine that just kind of came in and rescued him. And everyone knew that was Zeus rescuing the protagonist. Well, we've had our Christmas miracle truly this past December. The arrival of these vaccines, not only to work and be safe, but to work to the degree that they do, is truly a miracle in our time. If we were, I think it's on a biblical level, frankly. We have a plague, it's killing more people than we've ever could imagine, and here comes a vaccine that rescues us. And I'm just, it's almost hard to talk about because it's such a miracle in our lifetime. And for us to take advantage of that now is really our exit ramp out of this horrid epidemic. Next slide. Paul's already talked to you about the vaccine, so I'll go on to the next slide. And I just want to show one other thing about this graph, that if you focus in, I think if you hit the button again, maybe it'll show up. Nope, sorry. That in that first 12 to 13 days, there's no difference if you just focus on the left-hand side. But then at about day 13 or 14 after the first shot, that's when the split starts to happen. So that if you've just had your vaccine, if you count 2 weeks from that day, you already are beginning to get protected. And then when you get your second dose at day 21 or 28, then you're protected to a large degree. And could you get COVID? Yes, you can. But one thing, just to augment what Dr. Gifford said, it doesn't amplify the infection. In fact, it dampens it. So those people who do get sick have much milder symptoms, and the symptoms don't last nearly as long as the people who did not get vaccinated. So it's helping us not only in terms of preventing infection, it's helping us for those few people who do get infected after the fact and get symptoms. The symptoms are much, much milder than if they had had the natural infection. Our goal is to get everyone infected, and Dr. Moratzo is going to speak next about the concept of herd immunity. But this is the idea that we can get enough people vaccinated so that we can start to get rid of this. I'll make one other quick comment, and that's about the variants that we're hearing about in the community. Those are real, and they aren't quite to the numbers that we see, but every virus mutates a lot. And it's just the nature of the high levels of replication, hundreds of millions to billions of viruses produced a day with the average viral infection. And they make mistakes when they transcribe. And every now and then a mistake gives it a growth advantage. So you think back to Darwin, and that's survival of the fittest. Well, those new variants that are more fit will start to outgrow the others. What we need to do so far, those new variants are still susceptible to the antibodies produced by the vaccine. That's good news. We don't know if that's going to continue over time. So what we need to do now is get as many people vaccinated as quickly as we can to bring down the infection rates all over the board and get us out of this mess. So next slide, I think that might be Dr. Moratzo next. Oh no, this is, you've already heard about this in terms of side effects. And then the next slide.
Dr. Moratzo.
Yeah, and this is Dr. Moratzo. So I'll turn it over to my colleague in the ID division, our division director, Dr. Jeannie Moratzo.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thanks, Paul. I can't help but just note that a year ago, I was at a meeting at the NIH, and Dr. Tony Fauci came to talk to our group, which is the Vaccine Treatment and Evaluation Group that's done a lot of these vaccine studies. And that was the day that, or one of the days that we had been talking about the Wuhan virus, as it was called then. And in his talk, he appeared to be somewhat anxious, and he made a comment about how we had to pay attention to what was happening because coronaviruses could be serious business. And as always, he knows what he's talking about. And it really, I think, made everybody sit up straight and really say, wow, if Dr. Fauci, who has been in this business for 50 years, is concerned about this, I guess we should all get concerned. And I think you certainly have seen that today we surpassed 400,000 deaths in the United States, as Dr. Sag said, which is just a really sort of unimaginable tragedy. I think in terms of some hope, you've heard some great data from Dr. Gifford in particular, who's been a really important leader in the vaccine field. But I want to just talk about a couple of things, not so much to introduce or to diffuse optimism, because it is an incredible achievement, but just maybe to remind people that this is not over yet. And there are a couple of things that we have to stay realistic about. The first thing is that you probably have heard a lot in the last 6 months or so about this concept of herd immunity, and people point to diseases like smallpox. Why can't we just let people get infected or get them vaccinated enough so that we don't have to deal with this virus? And it essentially burns itself out in the population. And this slide, if you haven't really heard about this concept and maybe don't really understand it in a granular way, I think is a nice way to show it. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at a population of people, and every single one of those little octagons or hexagons, I guess, I can't tell what they are people. And if they are colored orange, they have been infected with the virus. And this degree of spread is very consistent with what we have seen with COVID. And you can see the virus in its little orange spiky self on the left-hand side. When you go to the middle panel there, you've got some people who are striped black and white who have some immunity, and it doesn't have to be lifelong immunity. It can just be immunity enough to break the cycle of transmission within this given network. And that's really important. We may be able to get herd immunity, even if this vaccine doesn't work to give us immunity for 5 years. And we can come back and talk about that if you have time. The problem is that, as you can see in that panel, you don't have enough people to really stem the surge of that virus through that entire network. It's not until you get to the far right side where you have densely immunized enough people so that every time the virus comes up to the next person and wants to take advantage of jumping to that person, it hits the roadblock of antibody or protection. And that's what you want to do. Now, look at that panel and you can sort of see how many of the people in this hypothetical network are immune. It's between probably 60 and 70%. And indeed, that is the current estimate right now for what we think we would need to achieve in terms of population levels of protective antibody in order to really set this up so you could not have this ongoing spread in a population. And the reality that I want to inject in there is that it's going to take us some time to get there. I think most people think that if we think about the population as a whole and don't just go in and target super spreaders, if we could even identify who they are, it's probably going to take at least 2 years. And that is even with more vaccines on the horizon. Dr. Vickers mentioned the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I understand we should hear the results of that probably later this month, if not next week, which would be really exciting. Even with more vaccines and even with ramped up productions, it's still going to be a challenge. So we are facing an uphill slog. So want to be sure everybody understands that concept of herd immunity. And Katie, if I could have the next slide, that would be great. The other complicating factor that Dr. Sag already mentioned is this idea of viral mutants. And absolutely right, he's an expert in the field of HIV, which is possibly the most incredible mutator. It has tons and tons of mutations literally every second. But what we're seeing with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, unfortunately, is not surprising. And what we're seeing is the emergence of these mutants that are taking advantage of the virus's ability to refine how well it can bind to our airways. So this B117 mutation that you probably have heard about, it's been called the UK variant. It's called the UK variant because it was detected in the UK this past November, and it subsequently has been attributed, it subsequently has been responsible for the majority of spread in most of the Southeast United Kingdom. What's scary about this virus is that it probably arose in maybe a single patient. It's not really clear. There's an excellent story in the New York Times last week about this, who was an immunosuppressed person, a transplant patient, a cancer patient, something like that, and probably had the virus selected over time because their immune system really couldn't control it. The reason this virus is important is because it's about 50% more infectious. Why? Because remember those little spike proteins that Dr. Gifford showed you on the vaccine, they have very specific binding areas that are the things that bind to the cells in your airway. And what these mutations do is essentially refine the fit of that spike protein so that it is stickier when it sees your respiratory pathway. And that means it's not really going to slough off if you cough. It's going to be very much more successful, 50% more successful at latching on to your cells and invading. The big $1+ trillion question, of course, is this just a function? Are these mutations just really going to increase the likelihood of infection? Or are they going to progressively evolve so that the vaccine doesn't work? Since the vaccine, as Paul mentioned, obviously targets antibody or creates antibody to the spike protein. We have not seen that yet, but I don't think it's out of the question. Many sort of virologic immunologists are really actively working on this. The other challenge with this is that, you know, the more you look for mutations, the more you find. The only reason the UK was so ahead of us in finding this variant is because they have an incredibly sophisticated surveillance system, which we do not have in the United States. So they're sampling viruses all the time, and we're not doing that. That said, just today, there was a new variant that was found in California called Cal20C. It has several mutations in the spike protein, and reportedly it accounted for more than half of the viruses that were isolated on January 13th. So I think the message is we're going to see this. It's a natural process with viruses, but we're really going to have to keep up our guard, not just with doing all the activities that we are so sick and tired of doing, from masks to social distancing, but really trying to get vaccinated, advance our ability to get herd immunity, and try to interrupt those network of transmissions. So next slide, please. And how are we doing with vaccine? This is an important slide because you may have seen some pretty negative portrayals of our situation in Alabama. In fact, the New York Times has a vaccine tracker, and we have been at the extreme bottom of the 50 states in terms of the data that they have been reporting. The Alabama Department of Public Health just earlier last weekend came out and issued a corrective estimate there. And this is what we're talking about. We've had about 380,000 doses delivered. We've got about double that allocated, but not delivered yet. And there is a lot of confusion about when, how, and how regularly these vaccines are getting delivered. It sounds like it's not the most transparent process. And we've actually administered not quite half of those, but really done a lot. At UAB, we've had a huge rollout. It has been really spectacular, I have to say. I really want to congratulate Dr. Sarah Nafziger and her team, who've just done an incredible job. But this is what we're currently dealing with, and it is a challenge, especially given the operational aspects of getting a vaccine with those storage requirements. So I don't think we're as bad as they say we are, but we could do better, and we've got to really keep at it, especially to get our vulnerable populations who sometimes don't have access to the internet to register. I mean, that's another thing. A lot of these systems are depending on people logging on to sign up to get the vaccine. And, you know, for many people who are 80, 85, 90, living healthy lives, not only may they not be wired, they may not even have the faintest idea how to do that. So that's a big concern, I think, that many of us have. I think the next slide is a transition to the Q&A, and I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here and for showing up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moratzo and Dr. Gifford and Dr. Sag. Like I said earlier, I have a list of questions that were pre-submitted, and I'll also ask some of the questions in the Q&A box. One of the questions that was submitted in Q&A is, will this session be made available to share? And it will be. So once the session is done, we have it recording and we will upload the session to our website, which is go.uab.edu/mini medical school. But since you were attendees, you will receive an email after this session with all the information. So I'm just going to start off Q&A, and whoever can just feel free to jump in. Several of the questions have already been answered that were submitted, so great job. If you've had the vaccine and interact with someone who is COVID positive, how likely is it that you can spread the virus to someone who hasn't had the vaccine? So in other words, can you still be a carrier if you've had the vaccine?
So you want me to start?
Sure.
Nobody knows. The problem is that all these vaccine studies, none of them, or they've done very little analysis on whether or not you can still spread the virus. And so my impression is that you probably can, but much, much less likely. So you have to remember that what happens when you get a vaccination is you have the immunity ready to go, but it doesn't kick in right away. You have stuff there, but it's not always there. You can't have stuff always there for everything, or you just would have too many different cells that are in your body. So there's a small amount, and you have to kick in the immune system. So what ends up happening is, in this situation, is that you get the virus, you have it, let's say, in your respiratory system, and now your immune system ramps up to get rid of the virus. Between the time that it ramps up and gets rid of it, you could potentially then be spreading the virus. And my suspicion is it's a lot less. If you look at animal model data, it's about 4 days. But if you don't vaccinate at all, it's about 10 days. So it cuts it in less than half. The problem with animal models is that it's just a model. Humans are different, and I suspect it'll be even less, but we don't know. I can tell you that this is an ongoing analytical study that's being done by multiple groups, and we're trying to get that answer. So I do think you're likely less infectious, but we just don't know. And that's why you should still wear a mask, not really to protect yourself against disease if you've been vaccinated, but to protect others from getting infected.
Thank you.
I don't know if others want to chime in.
Dr. Nafziger, I feel like this would be a question for you. What is a realistic timeline for community members to get the vaccine, and how can you sign up at UAB?
Well, let me talk about the timeline question first, because, we get asked this question a lot. And frankly, the answer is, once again, we don't know, but I can tell you a little more than just we don't know. What it really depends on is the allocation of vaccines to us. Here at UAB, and I know other places as well, but here we've developed some mechanisms for vaccine delivery that are very efficient. We've been vaccinating well over 1,000 people a day for about a month now. And we've also made preparations to set up other vaccine sites. So just yesterday, we opened up our Highlands parking deck drive-through vaccine site for patients. And that was a success. It's been in operation for 2 days now, so we're really pleased with that. And beyond that, we're working with community leaders to identify some other sites and making preparations to open some mass vaccination sites in other locations. We are ready to open those. We could potentially do it even as early as later this week. But the problem is just one simple thing. We don't have enough vaccine doses to do that. We've got staff in place, we've got supplies, we've got tents, and all the long list of things that you need to open up one of these sites, but we just don't have the vaccine doses yet. And so really that's what it boils down to for all the community members, for everybody who's wondering, when is it going to be my turn? It just boils down to when we get the vaccine doses. When we get them here, we know that UAB is scaled up to deliver them very quickly to our community. And I know that we're not the only place that has scaled up to do mass vaccine delivery very quickly and efficiently. I think everybody recognizes this is the thing that we have to do to extinguish this pandemic. So all resources are pointing towards that. Now, I know there was a second question in there, Katie, but you're going to have to remind me what it was because I already forgot it.
No, you're fine. Let's see. And then which one did I just ask? And then how can you sign up at UAB?
Thank you. I knew there was another piece there. So we have just rolled this out for our patients at UAB. Now we've already had it going for our healthcare workers and first responders for quite some time. And so we have a separate process for them. But for our patients, we have a separate process that we just rolled out yesterday. And so the way this works is we're targeting those patient populations for our established patients who are age 75 and older, and we're actually reaching out to them. We're sending them an email message, which comes through their patient portal, so that they can receive the invitation and sign up in that way. Now, we also know that a lot of our elderly patients in that age group, some of them may not be as much into technology as others. So we're using some more traditional methods of communication and calling them on the phone too. As we roll out this to more and more patient groups and hopefully are able to have enough doses to offer it to the community members as well, so people who may not be our established patients, we are going to make some more methodologies available for the sign up. But right now, that's where we are today. What I would advise everybody to do is pay close attention, because we're gonna be rolling out a lot of different things as the criteria change, as we have more and more doses available. We're going to be publishing that, and it'll probably change several times. So pay attention to our social media feeds and our marketing feeds, because we're going to let you know exactly how to sign up, because we want to get you in there as quickly as possible. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. This was a popular question, and Dr. Gifford, this might go to you. Is the vaccine safe for women who are pregnant, trying to get pregnant, or breastfeeding? Have there been studies on whether or not the vaccine affects fertility?
So the answer, unfortunately, like many different studies, we exclude pregnant women in the beginning. There are plans to test vaccines in pregnant women. However, we also know that pregnant women are at risk of developing severe COVID. And so there are many organizations that have weighed the pluses and minuses to this, and have felt that it's safe, and pregnant women should be offered the vaccination, to get the vaccination, because it likely the risks outweigh the benefit. The benefits outweigh the risk, for pregnant women and lactating women. And I think Dr. Moratzo may have something else to say about that.
Actually, I wasn't going to add anything, Paul. I think you're right. I know a number of, interestingly, pregnant physicians, residents who've posted pictures of themselves on Twitter getting vaccinated, and have thought a lot about this. I think are pretty persuaded that the risk benefit ratio is definitely in their favor to get vaccinated. And I think the more we learn about this infection in pregnancy, the more you don't want to get it when you're pregnant, especially if you're in a group that's more likely not to do as well with this infection. I was going to comment on the question about the pediatric trials, because someone asked about, and I've been getting a bunch of emails actually in the last week or so about people locally who want to get their teenagers in studies. Both Pfizer and Moderna, so the 2 mRNA vaccines that both Paul and Mike told you about tonight, are planning studies in pediatric populations. And the way they're going to be doing it is to gradually go down in age group. So they'll probably do it down to age 12 or so first, and then rapidly down to age 8, and then keep going down to make sure it's fine. The idea is to get enough data in kids who are school age in particular, so that we can plan to have them vaccinated before the school year next year, because nobody wants to see a delay in kids getting back to school. Suresh Bopanna, Dr. Suresh Bopanna, who is here in our pediatric department, who's a real expert in childhood viral illnesses, is the one who's working on this with Pfizer and Moderna for our institution. So we will definitely keep you posted for that, because I think it's going to be a great opportunity to get involved if you want your kids to do that too.
Thank you. One other question. What happens if you get the virus between your first and second dose of the vaccine?
So I think it's recommended, sort of like if you've gotten COVID infection previously, and that is, you probably should wait at least 3 months before getting your second vaccine dose. It's likely, though, that you probably do get a good boost of your immune system, but the problem is that the timing of the infection is just hard to know. So probably wait 3 months and then get your booster dose.
And then Dr. Knapsager, this might be for you, kind of in relation to that question. People were wondering, is there a system in place to ensure that you get your second dose in the allotted time frame that you're supposed to get it? Like, how does that work at UAB to make sure that you get it when you're supposed to? And if you don't, if you for some reason go too late, what happens then?
So the second dose creates a big challenge for us with this COVID vaccination project. It's just one of the many factors that's made this so very complicated. You know, I've said this before and I'll say again, this is not like rolling out flu shots. It's way more complicated. So the initial strategy from the federal level is that they were reserving the second doses. So if they give me 10,000 doses at UAB and say, Sarah, give these out, we're saving another 10,000 in the freezer here somewhere in a mysterious place, and we'll send those to you later. So that's what's been happening so far. When we have our first allotments, we give all those doses, and then at the right time, they send us the matching doses that go with them. So we haven't really had to worry about that too much. It hasn't been an issue for us here. Now, there's some conversation about whether that may change at the federal level. Some of that policy may be changing in the future. And, you know, what's going to happen, I don't know. So stay tuned. I think we'll be all watching the news to see if some of those second dose stores are going to be released in the hopes that the manufacturers can keep up and make new second doses in time for people to receive those. So more to come on that. But so far, we've been very lucky in that we've had the adequate doses to cover them.
Thank you. Dr. Gifford, I know I've heard you talk on this subject before. Someone submitted a question that said, what percentage of the trials performed were minority patients? So
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine trials were performed in the United States dominantly, and 10% or thereabout were African American, and about 15% were Hispanic. And then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine trial in the United States is about the same numbers, but remember, or not remember, the Johnson & Johnson trial also have arms in South Africa where the majority are Black individuals enrolling in those studies. And then in Latin America, where obviously Latinx is the majority in Latin America, they're enrolling. So that study will certainly have a great representation of people of color in those studies.
thank you. Also, do we have a time frame on how long the vaccine will protect you?
No, we don't know that. And there's two big issues with that. There's durability of the vaccine response, and it looks like you don't need a lot of antibody. At least that's the initial take, because you're protected after one dose potentially. But then the other thing has to do with what Dr. Moratzo was talking about, and that is that these variant strains, there's the variant strain in the United Kingdom appears to still be vaccine sensitive. There's one in South Africa that they're still testing it. It may not be as vaccine sensitive, but we hope it will be. But this virus is turning out to be a bit of a sneaky virus, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it mutated away from vaccine responses. But fortunately, because of the technology that we've developed, we can rapidly come up with a new vaccine. It would require another vaccination. But anyway, the long answer to that question is we don't know the durability of vaccine responses. For now, I think it's safe to say that a few months, it's going to work for a few months, hopefully much longer than that.
Thank you. Dr. Knapsager, this is probably a question for you. Are we going to go, I know right now you said we're starting with the 75 and older group. Are we going to take into account comorbidities, or are we just going to go by age?
So that's a great question. You know, we are really bound by the Alabama Department of Public Health's guidance on which groups that we choose to vaccinate. So that's a condition of our participation in the program and of receiving vaccine doses, is that we have to play by the rules. And so really it's not up to us, it's up to ADPH. Now, having said that, in the phases that are defined by the CDC, the playbook, if you will, that they're going by, one of the next places that they may go is looking at people who are age 65 and up, and then also looking at people who have medical conditions that make them at higher risk. So I think it's very likely that they'll move to that at some point. Now, when they do move to that, that's a lot more difficult to determine who has a high risk medical condition. You know, it's really easy to figure out how old somebody is, but it's a little bit harder to figure out who has a high risk medical condition. There's a lot of subjectivity to that. So that does make our job a little bit harder in figuring out who are the right target groups to vaccinate. But that's a challenge that we're just going to have to face that one down when we come to it. But I do think that will happen at some point in the future. Yes.
Thank you. I received a few questions about this, and I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation, so please forgive me. But what is the risk of getting Guillain-Barré syndrome? Yes, thank you. Following the vaccine and does having Parkinson's increase that risk?
I can take a first shot at that. The answer is no, there does not appear to be an increased risk for Guillain-Barré, even if you've had it before. And part of the reason for that is that the part of the vaccine that causes an allergic reaction is very different than what has been used in other vaccines and polyethylene glycol for this vaccine. It's not 100% for sure because this is all new, but the best estimates right now is that if somebody's had this before, that the risk is small for that to happen again. And the take-home point is, again, we're weighing out the risk of the Guillain-Barré, which is pretty horrible, versus catching COVID, which is also horrible. But it seems to be something that that most of the neurologic groups are saying is okay.
Perfect, thank you. What about people with asthma? Do you recommend that they get the vaccine?
Absolutely. Anybody can answer that. They're at high risk of having problems with COVID, and they would need it to allow them to get protected from COVID. Let me also just add to Dr. Sag, there's really only one reason not to get the COVID vaccine that's an absolute contraindication, and that is if you have an immediate hypersensitivity reaction to the COVID vaccine or polyethylene glycol, which is what is in the lipid nanoparticle that may be causing some of these anaphylactic reactions. Otherwise, it is recommended that you get it. Now, some people who have severe allergic reactions, it's recommended that they consult with the allergist or their provider, but almost everybody should be getting this vaccine.
Thank you. There was also a question submitted about, let's say a neighbor or a friend living in the community in their 80s or 90s who don't have access to internet or they're unable to make an appointment. Can someone make that appointment for them, Dr. Nafziger, to get a vaccine?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it would just depend on how close that friend or neighbor is. I know that over the last day or so, we have had a lot of friends and neighbors helping elderly patients register for vaccine. But one of the safety measures that we have in place at UAB for contacting our patients is we're actually calling them on the phone to make sure that we can contact all of them. And all of our patients, provide us with contact information, not only for themselves, but for their emergency contacts. So we're using all that information that we have at our disposal to reach our patients. Now, at some point in time, there's going to be a segment of the population who may be homebound, who may need other type of assistance. And to be quite honest with you, right now, there are not great plans in place for those people. I think that that's a problem that as a state we're looking at from a public health perspective to figure out how to get vaccine doses to all these different segments of the population that need it, that may be more difficult to reach. So that's definitely a problem we're thinking about. To be honest, we don't have a great solution yet.
Thank you. And I know we're over time, so I'll ask a couple more questions and then wrap up. But Dr. Gifford, I think this one is for you. Will the Johnson & Johnson vaccine be available soon, and is it expected to confer longer term protection than Pfizer or Moderna?
So Dr. Moratzo hinted at this. We don't know if it's effective yet. We anticipate it will be, but we don't know. We will know, though, probably by next week. They're thinking about looking at the efficacy. They're cleaning up all the data. It's going to be sent to the Data Safety Monitoring Board that makes this call because they are unblinded, and they will convene this weekend. So if we anticipate that it works, it may or may not be as effective as the mRNA vaccines. Remember that I'll tell you that the AstraZeneca vaccine, the one developed by the United Kingdom, was not quite as effective as the mRNA vaccines. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine shares some qualities with the AstraZeneca vaccine, but also shares some qualities with the mRNA vaccine. So we're waiting to see. In terms of long-term protection, I doubt that it will confer a longer-term protection than these other vaccines. But the benefit of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is it's just a single dose. And we will immediately have access to 12 million more doses in the United States if it works and the EUA gets approved, which the EUA is slated for the end of this month. So that would be tremendously beneficial to be able to have vaccine availability to more people in the United States.
Thank you. And then Dr. Moratzo, you touched on herd immunity. I know that this is a stretch, but do you have any idea when we might reach herd immunity?
So again, with all those caveats that we talked about, that we continue to have vaccine ramp up, that we get vaccines that are different, probably in terms of manufacturing. We work out all the kinks with storage and delivery. The number that I've heard Dr. Fauci cite and most people is probably about 2 years. So it is going to be a haul. That's why I think we have to temper our expectations and continue to try to hold the course. But hopefully, if we can get some good immunity with this first round, we can at least go back to some semblance of normality in our daily life.
Perfect. Okay, well, I think that can do it for the Q&A. We've gotten
Katie,
to
I had a quick question for Dr. Nassiger.
Oh, good.
I'm getting calls from 72 and 73 years old folks asking me if I can give them a fake ID. So are you carding people when they come in to make sure they're 75?
That's a great question. It's tough at a vaccine site to police. We try to get the correct people to sign up for them. We haven't been carding people, but we ask them when they sign up to make sure that they're honest about their birth date. So we are checking that for sure. But it's funny that you asked that, but it's a difficult thing for us suddenly to be policing who gets vaccine at our sites. We've had a lot of folks show up who would like to have it who didn't qualify, especially at our employee site, and had to turn them away. And I tell you, it's the worst feeling in the world when somebody comes up and wants a vaccine and you have to tell them no and tell them it's not quite your turn yet. But, most people have been very gracious about it. That's one thing I love about living here is people are very understanding and they're polite about waiting their turn. But so far, maybe we could make some money in the fake ID business, Mike. I'm not sure.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank everyone so much for attending. Dr. Sag, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. And we hope you're going to join us in the future. I tell you one thing that I've learned a lot, even though I've been at UAB for almost 37 years or 38 years, there's an awful lot of people I've met over the last 10 to 11 months working on COVID, a number of people in the health system and the hospital who I really had never come into contact much with. And having these interactions just keeps reminding me of what a special place UAB is and the partnerships that we have. And one of the key partnerships that we have is with the community. It's you guys who are joining us tonight. It's you guys who keep pushing us for developing more interventions. And yes, pushing us to get vaccines out as fast as we can is a big incitement. It creates excitement for us and an incentive for us to do the best we can. And that's something that we're very grateful of. We hope you really enjoyed tonight's session. We're going to be doing more of these. And I know that some of you still may have questions, but hopefully the answers that we gave you will help get you on your way. If you feel like you're motivated and want to support the UAB COVID effort with a philanthropic gift, there's a way to do that. You can go to gouab.edu/mini medical school. And we're going to get that out. You can see it on the screen there, but that's a place where you can go and get this. And it's also a site where information will be shared regarding future sessions. We hope to make this available on the website so that you can refer friends to it. It's been recorded. But as we sign off, I just want to thank everyone again. Thank all of our speakers. Thank Dr. Vickers and Katie. Thank you for helping to organize this. And we look forward to seeing you on our next session.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for submitting questions and for attending. Please share. You will get the recorded session and a follow-up email tomorrow. Thank you.